when they laughed at the elderly couple for inheriting a crumbling fairy tale castle that nobody wanted, they had no idea those same two people were about to uncover a $250 million secret that had been hidden in its walls for over 3 centuries. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Harold and Margaret Thompson had lived their entire married life in the same modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, where the paint peeled gently from the siding like old skin, and the front porch sagged just enough to remind you that everything beautiful eventually surrenders to time. Harold, 73, had worked 47 years at the textile mill before it closed, his hands permanently stained from decades of machinery, oil, and honest labor. Margaret, 71, had raised their 3 children in that house, stretched every dollar until it begged for mercy, and somehow managed to fill their small home with more love than most mansions ever knew. They were the kind of people who bought generic cereal, mended socks instead of throwing them away, and considered dinner at the local diner a special occasion worth saving up for. Their retirement consisted of Social Security checks that barely covered the essentials, prescription medications that cost more than their monthly grocery budget, and the quiet dignity of 2 people who had worked hard their entire lives and expected nothing more than to age gracefully together. The house on Maple Street told the story of their lives in its worn wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and the kitchen table where Margaret had helped 3 children with homework, while Harold balanced checkbooks by lamplight. The living room furniture was older than most of their grandchildren, but it was clean, comfortable, and arranged with the care of people who understood that home wasn't about what you owned, but about the memories you created within 4 familiar walls. Harold's workshop in the basement smelled of motor oil and sawdust, filled with tools he'd collected over 5 decades of fixing everything from neighbors' lawnmowers to his own ancient pickup truck. He was the kind of man who could make anything work again, with enough time, patience, and spare parts salvaged from other broken machines. Margaret's domain was the kitchen, where she performed daily miracles of turning leftovers into meals, coupons into grocery savings, and simple ingredients into the kind of comfort food that made their grandchildren beg to spend weekends at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Their daily routine had settled into the gentle rhythms of long marriage and advanced age. Harold rose at 6:30 each morning, made coffee in the percolator that had been their wedding gift 52 years ago, and sat on the front porch reading yesterday's newspaper that their neighbor saved for them. Margaret joined him at 7, bringing him a second cup and settling into the wooden rocking chair he'd built for her 60th birthday. They'd watch the neighborhood wake up, wave to familiar faces heading to work, and discuss the small dramas and joys that filled their quiet corner of the world. Neither of them had traveled more than 200 miles from their hometown since their honeymoon to Niagara Falls in 1971. They'd raised their children with careful attention to budgets and practical dreams. College for the kids had meant community college and student loans. Family vacations had meant camping trips to state parks and picnics packed in Margaret's carefully preserved Tupperware containers. Their 3 children had grown up, moved away, and started families of their own, with varying degrees of success and happiness. Linda, their eldest, had married a banker and lived in a suburb outside Charlotte, sending obligatory Christmas cards and making duty phone calls twice a month. David, the middle child, had struggled with addiction and unemployment, cycling through jobs and relationships with the unpredictability of someone who'd never quite figured out how to be an adult. Thomas, their youngest, had inherited their quiet determination and worked as a high school teacher in a town 3 states away, calling every Sunday and visiting twice a year with his wife and twin daughters. The Thompsons had learned to find contentment in small pleasures. Margaret's vegetable garden that produced enough tomatoes to share with the entire street. Harold's restored 1976 Ford pickup that still ran like a dream despite its rust and dents. Their weekly date nights at the local ice cream parlor, where they'd shared the same booth for 30 years. They understood that happiness didn't require wealth, just the ability to appreciate what you had and the wisdom to know when you had enough. But contentment doesn't pay medical bills or fix leaking roofs or replace furnaces that can give up after 35 years of faithful service. The small emergencies of aging had begun to accumulate faster than their limited income could address them. Harold's arthritis medication cost $200 a month, even with Medicare. Margaret's blood pressure pills weren't much cheaper. The house needed a new roof before winter. The plumbing leaked in ways that suggested major repairs were imminent, and their ancient car was making sounds that even Harold's mechanical expertise couldn't diagnose as anything but expensive. They'd learned to live with worry as a constant background hum, the way other people lived with traffic noise or neighbor dogs. Not panic, not desperation, just the low-level anxiety of people who knew that any unexpected expense could push them from struggling to crisis. They discussed these concerns only in whispers, late at night, when the house creaked around them and the weight of their limitations felt heaviest. So when the certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, bearing the letterhead of MacLeod, Fraser and Associates, Solicitors, Edinburgh, Scotland, Harold set down his coffee cup with trembling fingers and reached for his reading glasses, with the caution of a man who'd learned that unexpected mail usually contained unexpected problems. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and expensive-looking, in a way that seemed foreign to their world of utility bills and medical statements. Harold's name and address were written in elegant script across the front, and the international postmark gave the whole thing an air of importance that made both of them nervous. "What do you suppose this is?" Margaret asked, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd shared every morning for 15 years. "Only one way to find out," Harold replied, though his hands shook slightly as he sliced open the envelope with his pocket knife. The letter inside was written on paper, so heavy and elegant, it felt like cloth between his fingers. The law firm's letterhead was embossed in gold, and the formal language was the kind that seemed designed to intimidate rather than communicate. But as Harold read aloud in a voice that grew more bewildered with each sentence, the essential message became clear despite its legal complexities. Margaret Thompson was the sole surviving heir of one Millicent Rosalind McTavish, deceased, who had passed away 6 months earlier in Edinburgh at the age of 97. According to extensive genealogical research conducted by the estate's executors, Margaret was the great-niece of the deceased through her maternal grandmother's sister, a connection so distant that neither Harold nor Margaret could recall ever hearing Millicent's name mentioned in family conversations. But the most extraordinary part of the letter came in the second paragraph, where the solicitors formally notified Margaret that she had inherited, in its entirety, the estate known as Castle Ravenshallow, located in the Scottish Highlands approximately 40 miles northwest of Inverness. The property included the castle structure itself, outbuildings, and 147 acres of Highland countryside, along with all contents, furnishings, and artifacts currently housed within the structure. Margaret leaned over Harold's shoulder, her breath warm against his ear as she read along. "Castle Ravenshallow," she whispered, testing the words on her tongue like they were written in a foreign language. "Built in 1647. They're saying we inherited an actual castle, Harold." Harold reread the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated. According to the document, Castle Ravenshallow had been in the McTavish family for over 3 centuries, passing down through a complex line of inheritance that had somehow survived wars, political upheavals, and the general chaos of Scottish history. Millicent had been the last of her line, a spinster who had lived alone in Edinburgh, while the castle sat empty for the past 23 years. The letter went on to explain, in language that grew increasingly ominous with each paragraph, that the inheritance came with significant complications. Property taxes owed to the Scottish government totaled £43,000 and were currently 3 years in arrears. The castle had been declared structurally unsound by local authorities and would require extensive repairs before it could be legally occupied. Insurance costs, maintenance expenses, and utility connections would require substantial ongoing investment. The solicitors, speaking in the patient tone that lawyers reserved for clients who clearly didn't understand the magnitude of what they were facing, strongly suggested that Margaret might wish to consider simply disclaiming the inheritance and allowing the property to revert to the Scottish National Trust. This course of action would relieve her of all financial obligations while ensuring that the historic property would be properly maintained by professionals equipped to handle such complex estates. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Margaret said, sinking into her rocking chair as if the weight of the letter had made her too heavy to stand. "People like us don't inherit castles. We inherit old china, and maybe some costume jewelry if we're lucky." Harold folded the letter carefully and stared out across their small front yard, where Margaret's flower garden was surrendering to the first frost of autumn. The idea of inheriting a castle seemed as foreign to him as inheriting a spaceship or a throne. They were practical people who fixed their own plumbing and grew their own vegetables. What did they know about medieval architecture or Scottish property law, or the care and feeding of historic monuments? But something in the formal language of the letter, something in the dignity of phrases like estate of Castle Ravenshallow and artifacts currently housed within the structure, stirred something in Margaret's practical heart. This wasn't just a problem to be solved or a burden to be avoided. This was a connection to a past she'd never known she possessed, a link to ancestors who had lived in ways she couldn't imagine. "Harold," she said quietly, still holding the letter like it might disappear if she moved too quickly, "what if this is real? What if somewhere in Scotland there's actually a castle that belongs to us?" Harold looked at his wife of 52 years, noting the way her eyes had brightened with something he hadn't seen there in months. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. The same expression she'd worn when she decided to plant that first vegetable garden, or when she'd convinced him to take dancing lessons for their 40th anniversary, or when she'd suggested they adopt that stray cat, despite having no money for veterinary bills. "The lawyers are probably right," he said gently. "It's probably just a pile of old stones that'll cost us more than we'll ever have." "Probably," Margaret agreed, but she kept hold of the letter, reading it again and again, as if repetition might change its contents or make its implications clearer. Within a week, they were speaking to a representative from the Edinburgh law firm via a scratchy international phone connection that made every word sound like it was traveling through underwater cables. Alexander MacLeod, the solicitor handling the estate, spoke with the measured patience of a man who had delivered similar news to other bewildered heirs over the years. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his Scottish accent turning her name into something that sounded almost musical. "I understand this must come as quite a shock." Millicent McTavish was a rather eccentric woman who lived quite privately. She spent considerable resources tracking down her family connections, but she was never one for maintaining social relationships with distant relatives. "Can you tell us anything about the castle itself?" Margaret asked, having compiled a list of questions during the 3 nights she'd lain awake thinking about the inheritance. "Castle Ravenshallow is a Category A listed building," MacLeod explained, using a term that meant nothing to either Harold or Margaret. "It's considered a structure of national historic importance. The main keep dates to the mid-17th century, with additions made in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's been empty for over 20 years, but the structure remains fundamentally sound despite some weather damage and normal deterioration." "And you really think we should just sign it over to the government?" Harold asked. There was a pause on the international line, filled with static that sounded like distant rainfall. "Mr. Thompson, I must be honest with you. The financial obligations associated with maintaining a property of this type are substantial. Even basic weatherproofing and structural maintenance would likely cost more than most people's annual income. Unless you have significant financial resources at your disposal, ownership would be more of a burden than a blessing." But Margaret heard something in the lawyer's voice, a hesitation that suggested there was more to the story than simple financial calculations. "Mr. MacLeod," she said, "is there something else we should know about the castle?" Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Thompson, Millicent was, an unusual woman. She visited the castle regularly, until her health began to fail, despite the fact that it had no electricity or modern plumbing. She always insisted that the property held more significance than its simple architectural value. I'm not entirely certain what she meant by that, but she was quite adamant that the right heir would understand when they saw it for themselves. Harold and Margaret looked at each other across their kitchen table, both thinking the same thing but neither wanting to be the first to voice it. They were 73 and 71 years old, respectively. They had never traveled outside the United States. They had no experience with international law, historic preservation, or castle maintenance. By any reasonable standard, they should take the lawyer's advice, sign the disclaimers, and go back to their quiet life on Maple Street. But reasonable had never gotten them anything except a lifetime of careful budgeting and deferred dreams. "Mr. MacLeod," Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, "we'd like to see it. The castle. Before we make any decisions, we'd like to see what we've inherited." The announcement of their inheritance spread through their small town of Millbrook, faster than gossip at a church social. Harold and Margaret had lived there their entire married lives, raised their children in the same neighborhood where they'd bought their first house. And everyone knew everyone else's business, with the intimate thoroughness that only small communities can achieve. The initial reaction was disbelief. The Thompsons, who clipped coupons religiously and drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a temperamental air conditioner, had inherited a castle. It seemed like the setup for a joke rather than actual news. At Morrison's Hardware, where Harold had shopped for tools and supplies for 37 years, the reaction was skeptical amusement. Bill Morrison, the owner's son who'd taken over the business 5 years earlier, couldn't suppress a grin when Harold mentioned he might be taking a trip to Scotland. "So, Harold, I hear you're moving to your palace overseas," Bill said loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Guess we won't be seeing much of you common folk anymore. Should I start addressing you as Your Lordship or just Your Majesty?" The other men in the store chuckled, and Harold felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. These were people he'd known for decades, neighbors who'd helped him move furniture and borrowed his tools and shared coffee and complaints about everything from property taxes to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now they were looking at him like he was either delusional or putting on airs. "It's probably nothing," Harold said quietly, selecting the screws he needed and trying to ignore the way the conversation had shifted around him. "Just some old building that's falling down. Lawyers say we should sign it over to the government." "Well, that's probably the smart thing to do," agreed Frank Kowalski, who'd worked alongside Harold at the textile mill for 15 years before it closed. "You know what they say about things that sound too good to be true." Margaret faced similar reactions at the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the library where she volunteered 2 afternoons a week shelving books. The cashier at Save Mart, a woman named Donna who'd checked Margaret's groceries for 12 years, looked at her with barely concealed pity. "Margaret, honey, I hope you're not getting your hopes up about this castle business," Donna said while scanning Margaret's careful selection of sale items and generic brands. "You know how these inheritance scams work these days. They probably just want you to send money for taxes or legal fees or something." "It's not a scam," Margaret replied, though she could hear the defensiveness in her own voice. "We spoke to the lawyers in Scotland. It's legitimate." Donna's expression suggested she thought Margaret was either lying or being fooled. "Well, even if it is real, what are you two going to do with a castle? You can barely afford to fix your own roof, no offense. These old places cost a fortune just to heat, never mind actually maintaining them." The most painful reactions came from people who should have been supportive. Their neighbor Robert, who had lived next door for 18 years and helped Harold install their new kitchen sink just last summer, cornered him while he was checking the mail. "Harold, you're not seriously thinking about going to Scotland, are you?" Robert asked, with the tone of someone trying to talk sense into a confused elderly relative. "At your age? Come on, Harold, be sensible. Even if this castle thing is real, what are you going to do with it? You two can barely manage the stairs in your own house some days." Even their pastor at the Methodist church they'd attended for 41 years seemed more concerned than congratulatory. Pastor Williams pulled them aside after Sunday service, his kind face creased with worry. "Harold, Margaret, I've been praying about your situation," he said in the gentle voice he used for hospital visits and family crises. "I hope you'll be very careful about any decisions you make. Sometimes what seems like a blessing can turn into a burden if we're not wise about how we handle it." Their own children's reactions were perhaps the most discouraging of all. When they called Linda to share the news, her response was immediate skepticism, followed by barely concealed condescension. "Mom, Dad, I think you need to be very careful here," Linda said, in the tone she usually reserved for explaining technology to them. "These inheritance scams are very sophisticated these days. Are you absolutely certain this is legitimate? Have you verified it through any American authorities? Maybe you should talk to a lawyer here in town before you do anything." When Margaret tried to explain that they'd already spoken to the Scottish solicitors multiple times and verified the authenticity of inheritance, Linda's concern shifted to practical objections. "Even if it's real, what are you planning to do with a castle in Scotland? You've never even been on an airplane. You don't have passports. The cost of traveling there alone would probably wipe out your savings. And for what? To look at some crumbling old building you can't afford to maintain?" Their son, David, was more direct, speaking with the blunt honesty of someone who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between dreams and reality. "Dad, this sounds like one of those deals that's too good to be true, because it probably is," he said during a brief phone call between his job at the auto parts store and his evening shift at the gas station. "Even if it's real, what are you two going to do with a castle? You can barely afford to maintain the house you've got. Don't let some fairy tale story make you do something stupid with what little money you have." Only their youngest son, Thomas, offered anything resembling encouragement, though even his support was tempered with realistic concerns. "If it's legitimate," he said carefully during their Sunday evening phone call, "then maybe this could be something amazing for you. I mean, how many people get a chance like this at any age, let alone at yours? But you have to be smart about it. Don't rush into anything. Make sure you understand all the implications before you commit to anything." But the doubt was infectious, spreading through their daily conversations like a persistent fog. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe they were being naive elderly dreamers who didn't understand the complexities of international property law or the realities of maintaining historic buildings. Maybe the inheritance was real but worthless, a burden disguised as a gift. The logistics of simply investigating their inheritance seemed overwhelming when viewed through the lens of their neighbors' skepticism. They would need passports, which meant trips to the post office for applications and fees they hadn't budgeted for. They would need plane tickets, which cost more than they'd ever spent on anything except their house and car. They would need accommodations in Scotland, rental cars, and all the other expenses of international travel that seemed impossibly exotic to people who'd never stayed in a hotel that cost more than $60 a night. "Maybe everyone's right," Margaret said one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching their neighbor's cat hunt something invisible in the fading light. "Maybe we're being foolish old dreamers who should know better." Harold was quiet for a long time, rocking gently in the chair he'd built with his own hands 30 years earlier. He'd been thinking about the reactions they'd received, about the mixture of amusement, pity, and condescension that seemed to follow them everywhere they went since word of the inheritance had spread. "Maggie," he said finally, using the nickname he'd called her since they were teenagers dating at the local soda fountain, "we've spent our whole lives being sensible. We saved instead of spending, worked instead of playing, planned for the future instead of living in the present. We did everything right, everything responsible, everything practical." He reached over and took her weathered hand in his, noting how the evening light caught the thin gold band she'd worn for 52 years. "And where has all that sensible behavior gotten us? We're 73 and 71 years old, living on Social Security checks that barely cover the basics, and watching our house fall apart around us because we can't afford to fix it properly. We've been practical our whole lives, and we're still worried about money, still struggling to make ends meet. still putting off things we want to do because they're not sensible. Margaret squeezed his hand, understanding what he was trying to say but still feeling the weight of everyone's expectations and concerns. "What if we fail?" she asked quietly. "What if we spend our savings on this trip and it turns out to be nothing but ruins and disappointment? What if everyone's right and we're just foolish old people who don't know when to quit dreaming?" Harold turned to look at his wife, studying the face he'd loved for over half a century. The evening light softened the lines that worry and time had etched around her eyes, and for a moment he could see the young woman who'd agreed to marry him, when they both had more dreams than sense. "Then we'll have failed at something worth failing at," he said simply. "We'll have chased one dream, taken one risk, done one impractical thing before we're too old to do anything at all. And maybe that's better than spending the rest of our lives wondering what might have been." The decision to travel to Scotland wasn't made all at once but gradually, like water slowly wearing away stone. They spent days discussing the practical challenges, the financial implications, the very real possibility that they were making a mistake that would cost them money they couldn't afford to lose. But with each conversation, each returned phone call from the solicitor's office in Edinburgh, each piece of documentation that arrived in the mail, the inheritance became more real, and their obligation to at least investigate it became more compelling. They applied for passports using photographs that made them both look startled and older than they felt, filling out forms that asked questions about travel history they didn't possess. They researched flights and found prices that made Margaret gasp audibly, but Harold quietly transferred money from their savings account, the fund they'd been carefully building for their own funeral expenses and emergency medical costs. The decision to keep their travel plans secret from their neighbors and most of their family was made partly from pride and partly from practical considerations. They didn't want to endure more skeptical comments or well-meaning advice about the foolishness of their decision. If they were going to make a mistake, they preferred to make it privately. Only Thomas knew about their actual travel plans, and he'd promised to check on their house and collect their mail while providing a cover story about them, visiting an old friend if anyone asked. The rest of the town would learn about their trip from the absence of their daily routines. Harold's morning walk to the post office, Margaret's Tuesday trips to the library, their shared Sunday afternoons sitting on the front porch, watching the world go by. The night before they left, they sat in their living room surrounded by half-packed suitcases and the accumulated possessions of a life lived carefully. Margaret held a printout of a photograph the Scottish lawyers had emailed to them, studying the grainy black and white image of Castle Ravenshollow, as if she could divine their future from its medieval towers and crumbling walls. The castle in the photograph looked like something from a fairy tale, all Gothic arches and stone battlements rising from Highland mist. But it also looked ancient, weathered, and more than a little forbidding. The image quality was poor, obviously taken from a significant distance, and showed a structure that seemed to have been built more for defense than comfort. "What if everyone's right?" Margaret asked for perhaps the 100th time since they'd decided to make the trip. "What if we get there and it's just ruins? What if we've wasted our money on this wild goose chase?" Harold looked at his wife, noting the way her hands shook slightly from the medication she took for her heart condition. The way her eyes had grown cloudy from developing cataracts they couldn't afford to have surgically corrected. At their age, with their health concerns and limited resources, this trip represented a significant risk. But it also represented the only adventure they were likely to have, the only chance to step outside the careful boundaries of their practical life and see what lay beyond. "Then we'll have wasted our money on the adventure of a lifetime," he said quietly. "And that seems like a pretty good way to waste money, if you ask me." The flight to Scotland was the longest journey either of them had ever taken, and they held hands during takeoff like teenagers on their first date, both amazed and terrified by the idea that in less than 9 hours they would be on a different continent, breathing foreign air and standing on ground that had been walked by ancestors whose names they'd never known. Margaret had never been on an airplane before, and she gripped the armrests during turbulence with white knuckles, while Harold pretended to read a magazine to hide his own nervousness about flying. They were easily the oldest passengers in coach, surrounded by younger travelers who seemed to take international flight for granted. And Harold couldn't help but notice the curious looks they received from flight attendants who were clearly wondering why two elderly Americans were traveling to Scotland with such small suitcases and such obvious inexperience. The overnight flight felt endless, filled with uncomfortable seats, mysterious airline food, and the strange experience of watching the sun set and rise through the small oval window while crossing time zones that made Harold's watch meaningless. Neither of them slept much, too excited and nervous about what awaited them to relax into the airline's cramped accommodations. 8 hours later, they landed in Edinburgh, exhausted, disoriented, and immediately overwhelmed by accents they struggled to understand and a pace of life that seemed much faster than anything they were accustomed to. The airport was larger than any building they'd ever been inside, filled with shops selling things they'd never heard of, and announcements in languages they couldn't identify. Collecting their luggage, clearing customs, and finding their way to the rental car counter took twice as long as they'd anticipated, partly because of their inexperience with international travel, and partly because Harold kept stopping to rest his back, which had stiffened during the long flight. By the time they reached the rental car agency, it was late afternoon, and they were both feeling the combination of exhaustion and anxiety that comes from being completely out of one's element. The rental car was smaller than anything they'd ever driven, a compact model with manual transmission and right-hand drive that Harold stared at for several minutes before attempting to adjust the mirrors and seat. The steering wheel was on the wrong side. The roads were narrower than anything he was used to, and the GPS system spoke with an accent that made its directions sound like suggestions rather than commands. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Margaret asked, noting the way Harold's hands gripped the steering wheel and the careful way he checked his mirrors before pulling out of the parking space. "No," Harold admitted, "but I'm going to try anyway." The drive from Edinburgh to Castle Ravenshallow took nearly 4 hours through countryside, so beautiful it made Margaret's chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. Rolling green hills dotted with sheep, ancient stone walls that seemed to grow organically from the earth itself, and skies so vast and changeable, they looked like they'd been painted by an artist with unlimited time and an infinite palette of grays and blues. They stopped twice to rest Harold's back and to consult maps that seemed designed by people who'd never actually tried to use them for navigation. Road signs pointed to towns with names they couldn't pronounce, and the narrow highland roads wound through landscapes that looked like they hadn't changed in centuries. As they drove deeper into the Scottish Highlands, Margaret began to understand why their distant relative had chosen to live in such remote beauty. This wasn't just countryside, it was landscape with a soul, geography that spoke to something deeper than practical concerns about convenience and accessibility. When they finally turned off the main road and began following the winding track that the GPS insisted would lead to Castle Ravenshallow, both of them fell silent with anticipation and growing nervousness. The access road was little more than a dirt path, lined with ancient stone walls and overgrown with vegetation that scraped against the sides of their small rental car. And then, as they crested a small hill and the road curved to the left, they saw it. Castle Ravenshallow rose from the highland landscape like something from a medieval dream, its grey stone walls and broken towers reaching toward the cloudy sky with a dignity that 5 centuries of weather hadn't been able to diminish. The structure was larger than the photograph had suggested, sprawling across several acres in a complex arrangement of keeps, walls, and courtyards that spoke of centuries of additions and modifications. But it was also more ruined than they had expected. Sections of the roof had collapsed, leaving some chambers open to the sky. Windows that had once held glass now gaped like empty eyes. Ivy covered much of the eastern wall, and several of the towers leaned at angles that suggested they were held upright more by habit and luck than by sound structural engineering. Harold stopped the car in what had once been a courtyard, turning off the engine and staring through the windshield at their inheritance with a mixture of awe and dismay. "Well," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "it certainly looks like a castle." Margaret laughed despite herself, a sound that contained equal parts humor and near hysteria. "It looks like a castle that lost a war about 300 years ago and never quite recovered." They sat in the rental car for several minutes, neither wanting to be the first to voice the obvious conclusion that everyone back home had been right. The castle was magnificent in its way, but it was also clearly a ruin, a structure that would require millions of dollars and years of work to restore to anything resembling habitability. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the highland wind whistling through the broken stones and the occasional cry of a bird they couldn't identify. Margaret could feel the weight of all the skeptical comments they'd received, all the practical advice they'd ignored, all the money they'd spent to travel halfway around the world to see a pile of picturesque rubble. Finally, Margaret opened her door and stepped out onto ground that squelched beneath her sensible walking shoes. "Well," she said with forced cheerfulness, "we didn't come all this way to sit in a rental car and stare at it. Let's go see what we've inherited." The castle was larger than it had appeared from the road, sprawling across several acres in a complex arrangement of towers, walls, and courtyards that had been built and rebuilt over several centuries. Some sections were completely roofless, open to the sky like stone skeletons bleaching in the highland air, while others retained enough structure to suggest they had once been magnificent. Ivy covered much of the eastern wall in a thick green tapestry, and several of the towers leaned at angles that suggested they were held upright more by centuries of habit than by sound engineering principles. Harold and Margaret picked their way carefully through the main courtyard, avoiding loose stones and holes that could easily twist an elderly ankle. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, a mixture of ancient cobblestones and earth that had shifted and settled over the decades since the last inhabitants had walked these paths. Weeds grew between the stones, and small trees had taken root in corners where wind-blown soil had accumulated over the years. The main entrance was an arched doorway tall enough for a mounted knight in full armor, but the massive wooden doors had long since rotted away, leaving only iron hinges hanging like broken arms against the stone frame. The hinges themselves were works of art, forged by craftsmen who had understood that even functional items should be beautiful, decorated with scrollwork that spoke of an age when time moved more slowly and quality mattered more than speed. "Watch your step," Harold murmured, as they crossed the threshold into what had once been the great hall. His voice echoed strangely in the vast space, bouncing off stone walls and disappearing into shadows that seemed to have been waiting centuries for visitors to return. The floor was uneven flagstone, cracked and worn smooth by countless generations of footsteps. Some of the stones had shifted over time, creating small ridges and depressions that required careful navigation. High above them, portions of the vaulted ceiling remained intact, creating a cathedral-like space that still commanded respect despite its decay. Where the roof had failed, beams of afternoon sunlight slanted down through the broken masonry, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny ghosts. Margaret pulled a small flashlight from her purse and played the beam across the walls, revealing the remnants of what had once been elaborate decorations. Faded traces of frescoes could still be seen in protected corners, and the mounting points for tapestries and weapons were still visible as dark squares against the lighter stone, where centuries of soot and candle smoke had been blocked by hanging furnishings. "Someone lived here," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the spirits of the previous inhabitants. "Someone called this place home for hundreds of years." Harold nodded, trying to imagine what the great hall had looked like in its prime. Long tables filled with feasting nobles, fires blazing in the massive hearth, the walls bright with tapestries and the gleam of polished weapons. The scale of the room suggested a way of life that was entirely foreign to their modern understanding of domestic comfort. but there was something about the proportions and the craftsmanship that spoke to a deeper human need for beauty and grandeur. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the castle room by room, chamber by chamber, staircase by treacherous staircase. Each space told part of the story of the families who had lived here over the centuries, and each room revealed new evidence of the castle's complex history. The kitchen was a cavern of stone with a fireplace large enough to roast an entire ox, its chimney disappearing into darkness high above. Iron hooks still hung from blackened beams, where meat had once been cured in the smoke from the great fires. Stone sinks carved directly from single blocks of granite remained fitted with lead pipes that spoke of surprisingly sophisticated plumbing for a medieval structure. The bedchambers varied in size and luxury, from small monks' cells that had probably housed servants or minor clergy to grand apartments with fireplaces large enough to stand inside and windows that provided breathtaking views of the surrounding highlands. Many still retained traces of their original furnishings. Broken bed frames carved from oak that had grown in forests cleared centuries ago. Washstands fitted with basins that had been crafted by artisans whose names were lost to history. In what had obviously been the Lord's private chambers, they found a circular room at the top of the best-preserved tower. The space was fitted with windows facing in all directions, providing a commanding view of the entire surrounding landscape. Despite the broken glass and bird droppings that had accumulated over the decades, the room retained an air of faded grandeur that made Margaret catch her breath. "Harold," she whispered, moving to the eastern window and looking out over a landscape that stretched to the horizon. "Look at this view." Harold joined her at the window, placing his hand on her shoulder as they stood together in the fading afternoon light. The sun was beginning to set, painting the highlands in shades of gold and purple that seemed to change even as they watched. From their elevated position, they could see for miles across rolling hills, ancient forests, and the serpentine curves of a river that reflected the sky like a ribbon of silver. "It's magnificent," Margaret said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Or it was, anyway." Harold nodded, understanding what she meant. Even in its ruined state, the castle possessed a dignity and beauty that spoke to something fundamental in the human spirit. This wasn't just a pile of old stones, as their neighbors had suggested. This was history made tangible, dreams and ambitions that had outlasted the dreamers themselves, a physical manifestation of the human desire to build something that would endure. But as they explored further, both Harold and Margaret began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. The castle was certainly old and certainly damaged by weather and neglect, but some aspects of the decay seemed inconsistent. Sections that should have been the most vulnerable to the elements were in better condition than areas that should have been protected. Some rooms appeared to have been recently disturbed, as if someone had been living in or at least visiting the structure more recently than the 23 years of abandonment that the lawyers had described. More puzzling were the architectural inconsistencies they began to notice as Harold's methodical engineer's mind started to map the layout of the structure. Some of the walls were significantly thicker than others, even in areas where defensive considerations wouldn't explain the difference. Several rooms seemed smaller inside than their exterior dimensions suggested they should be, and there were doorways that led to walls instead of passages, stairs that ended in solid stone, and windows that looked inward to other rooms instead of outward to the landscape. "Harold," Margaret said, as they explored what appeared to be a library in one of the towers, "something isn't right about this room." The library had obviously been magnificent once. Stone shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, built directly into the masonry with a precision that spoke of master craftsmanship. Many of the shelves still held books, though centuries of moisture and temperature changes had reduced most of them to illegible masses of mold and decay. A few volumes in the most protected corners retained enough structure to suggest they had once been beautiful, illuminated manuscripts, bound in leather and decorated with metalwork that gleamed despite the patina of age. But Margaret wasn't looking at the books. She was studying the room's proportions, comparing what she could see to what she remembered of the tower's external dimensions. "This space should be larger," she said, moving along the curved wall and tapping it with her knuckles. "From the outside, this tower looks like it should be at least 50 feet in diameter. But this room can't be more than 30 feet across." Harold joined her examination, bringing his flashlight to bear on the section of wall she was testing. The stones in this area looked identical to those in the rest of the room, fitted together with the same precision and finished with the same attention to detail. But when he tapped them, as Margaret had been doing, the sound was different. Subtly different, but unmistakably hollow. "There's space behind this wall," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had spent decades diagnosing problems by sound and feel. "Either another room, or at least a cavity of some kind." Margaret's pulse quickened as she began to examine the wall more systematically, running her hands along the joints between the stones, looking for any irregularity or mechanism that might indicate a hidden entrance. Medieval castles were famous for their secret passages and hidden chambers, built to provide escape routes during sieges or to protect valuables from invading armies. It was Harold who found the trigger. Behind a loose stone at about shoulder height, his fingers discovered a small iron lever, rusted with age but still functional. When he pressed it carefully, they heard a grinding sound from within the walls, the protest of ancient mechanisms that hadn't been used in decades. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. Before Harold could respond, a section of the wall began to move. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical flourish of a movie secret passage, but slowly and reluctantly, as if the mechanism was fighting against centuries of rust and neglect. A panel, perhaps 4 feet wide, swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow corridor that disappeared into darkness. Margaret gripped Harold's arm tightly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. They had found it. After centuries of abandonment, after decades of rumors and speculation about the castle's secrets, they had discovered one of Castle Ravenshallow's hidden passages. Harold shined his flashlight into the opening, revealing stone steps leading downward into what appeared to be the foundations of the castle. The air that flowed from the passage was cool and dry, carrying scents of old stone and something else, something that might have been aged leather or ancient wood. "Should we?" Harold began, but Margaret was already pushing past him into the hidden corridor. "After all these years of everyone telling us to be sensible," she called back over her shoulder, her voice echoing in the narrow space, "I think it's time to be adventurous." The passage was narrow enough that they had to walk single file, and low enough that Harold had to stoop to avoid hitting his head on the stone ceiling. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, suggesting that this wasn't just an emergency escape route, but a regularly traveled path between the visible castle and whatever lay hidden below. As they descended, Margaret counted the steps under her breath, a habit left over from her childhood, fear of getting lost in unfamiliar places. 57 steps down, the passage began to level out and widen, and the quality of the construction changed, subtly. The walls here were carved directly from the bedrock beneath the castle, fitted and finished with the same precision as the visible structure above, but clearly designed to remain hidden from casual observation. After what felt like an endless walk through increasing darkness, the passage opened into a chamber that made both of them gasp in astonishment. The room was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that had been carved and painted with images that were still visible despite their age. Around the perimeter of the room, stone shelves had been built into the walls at various heights, and those shelves were filled with objects that gleamed and sparkled even in the dim light of their flashlights. Margaret approached the nearest shelf cautiously, as if the objects might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her beam revealed gold chalices that caught and reflected the light like captured sunshine, silver plates decorated with intricate engravings, jewelry that sparkled with what appeared to be genuine gemstones, and small wooden chests that looked heavy enough to contain significant treasure. "Harold," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "What is all this?" Harold moved to examine another section of shelving, his engineer's mind trying to process what they were seeing, while his emotions struggled with the impossibility of it all. The objects appeared to be genuine antiques, not reproductions or tourist souvenirs, but actual medieval and Renaissance artifacts that belonged in museums rather than hidden chambers beneath abandoned castles. There were weapons with jeweled hilts that reflected their flashlight beams in patterns of red and blue fire. Religious artifacts that looked like they had been crafted for use in royal chapels or cathedral altars. Books bound in leather, so fine it seemed to glow with an inner light, their pages edged in gold leaf that still gleamed after centuries in darkness. And there was gold, more gold than either of them had ever seen outside of movies or museum exhibitions. Coins, bars, decorative objects, and jewelry that represented a fortune beyond anything they had ever imagined owning. "I think," Harold said slowly, his voice hushed with awe and disbelief, "we've found the reason this castle has been abandoned for so long." But the circular chamber was only the beginning. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they began to notice other passages leading away from the treasure room, disappearing into the darkness in multiple directions. They were standing at the center of what appeared to be an underground complex, a hidden network of rooms and corridors that had been built beneath the visible castle. Margaret moved to examine the painted ceiling more closely, and what she saw there made her grab Harold's arm with trembling fingers. "Harold, look at this. These aren't just decorative paintings. They're diagrams." The ceiling had been painted with an intricate map that showed the layout of the hidden chambers, complete with symbols and markings that indicated the contents of each room. According to the painted guide, the chamber they were standing in was just one of 7 interconnected spaces, each designed to house different types of treasures and artifacts. "It's like a treasure map," Margaret breathed, "painted right over our heads by whoever built this place." Following the map, they spent the next several hours exploring the underground complex, moving from chamber to chamber with growing amazement and disbelief. Each room contained treasures that seemed more incredible than the last. Collections that represented not just monetary value, but cultural and historical significance that would be priceless to scholars and museums around the world. The second chamber contained what appeared to be a library of illuminated manuscripts, their pages protected by oiled leather covers and stored in specially constructed cases that had somehow preserved them through the centuries. Margaret, who had always been a lover of books and learning, handled them with the reverence of someone touching sacred relics. Many were written in languages she couldn't identify. But the artwork was breathtaking gold leaf illustrations, intricate calligraphy, and marginalia that had been added by readers across multiple centuries. The third chamber was an armory that contained weapons spanning several centuries of military evolution. Medieval swords and shields hung alongside Renaissance firearms that looked like they had never been fired. Each piece was a work of art, in addition to being a functional weapon, decorated with engravings and inlays that spoke of master craftsmen working at the peak of their abilities. The fourth chamber housed what could only be described as a royal treasury, chests filled with gold coins from dozens of different countries and historical periods, bags of precious gems that sparkled like captured starlight in their flashlight beams, crown jewels and ceremonial regalia that looked like they belonged to kings and queens rather than Highland nobility. But it was the fifth chamber that truly took their breath away. This room was larger than the others, with a higher ceiling that had been painted with a magnificent mural depicting the history of what was obviously the Mackenzie family. Around the walls, displayed on specially built stands and pedestals, were paintings that even Harold's untrained eye recognized as the work of master artists. There were portraits that could have been painted by Rembrandt or Van Dyck, their subjects gazing out from the canvases with an intensity that seemed to bridge the centuries. Landscapes that captured the beauty of the Scottish Highlands with a skill and sensitivity that belonged in the world's finest museums. Religious scenes that seemed to glow with inner light, even after centuries in darkness. "Harold," Margaret whispered, moving from painting to painting with her flashlight, "these have to be worth millions of dollars, each one of them. This isn't just treasure, this is a collection that represents the pinnacle of European art and culture." Harold nodded, though he was having difficulty processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. They had come to Scotland, expecting to inherit a crumbling castle that would cost them more than it was worth. Instead, they had discovered what appeared to be one of the most significant private art and treasure collections in European history. The sixth chamber contained documents, hundreds of them, stored in specially designed cases that had protected them from moisture and decay. Many were written in the archaic Scots dialect that neither of them could read, but others were in English, and those told a story that explained how such an incredible collection had come to be hidden beneath a Highland castle. According to the documents, the treasure had been assembled over several generations by the Mackenzie family, but it had been hidden in these chambers during the 18th century by Alexander Mackenzie, the last laird to live permanently at Castle Ravenshallow. The papers told of his growing concern about English confiscation of Scottish assets following the failed Jacobite uprising of 1745, and his determination to preserve not just his family's wealth, but artifacts and treasures that had been entrusted to him by other Scottish families facing similar threats. The documents also revealed that Alexander had left detailed instructions for his heirs, explaining how to access the hidden chambers and what to do with their contents. Unfortunately, his sudden death from fever in 1768 had apparently prevented him from sharing this information with his son, and the secret had died with him. "We're not just inheritors," Margaret said, reading through one of Alexander's letters by flashlight, her voice thick with emotion. "We're guardians." He trusted his family to protect these things, and somehow, after all these years, that responsibility has fallen to us. The seventh and final chamber was perhaps the most moving of all. It contained not treasures in the monetary sense, but the personal artifacts that the Mackenzie family had treasured most. Children's toys carved from wood and dressed in tiny clothes that had been sewn with loving care. Family portraits that captured intimate moments rather than formal poses. Personal jewelry that had been worn daily rather than saved for special occasions. Items that had no particular market value but clearly held deep sentimental meaning. It was in this final chamber that they found Alexander Mackenzie's personal journal, a leather-bound book that contained his thoughts and motivations for creating the hidden treasury. His handwriting was difficult to read, faded with age, and written in a style that belonged to another century, but his meaning was unmistakable. "I have created this sanctuary." One entry read in careful script, "Not for myself, but for those who will come after me. These objects are not merely valuable, they are the soul of Scotland, made manifest in gold and stone and paint. Whoever discovers this place in years to come, I pray they will understand that they hold not just treasure, but trust." Harold and Margaret emerged from the underground chambers late in the evening, blinking in the last light of the Highland sunset like moles coming to the surface after a lifetime underground. They had been in the hidden complex for over 8 hours, and the normal world of crumbling stones and broken windows seemed surreal after the wonders they had witnessed below. They sat in the great hall of the castle, surrounded by the decay and neglect of centuries, and tried to process what they had discovered. The magnitude of the treasure was almost incomprehensible. Even a conservative estimate suggested that the collection was worth well over £100 million, and possibly much more, depending on the authentication and provenance of individual pieces. More importantly, they understood now why the castle had remained in the family for so many generations, despite being expensive to maintain and difficult to live in. This wasn't just a residence, it was a vault, a repository for treasures that represented not just monetary wealth, but the cultural heritage of Scotland itself. "We can't tell anyone," Margaret said finally, her voice hoarse from excitement and exhaustion. "Not yet, anyway. We need to think this through very carefully." Harold nodded, understanding her caution. They were two elderly Americans, with no experience in art authentication, international law, or the management of cultural artifacts. Making the wrong decision could result in the treasure being seized by governments, stolen by criminals, or lost to bureaucratic complications they couldn't even imagine. "We need help," he said quietly, "professional help. But we need to be very careful about who we trust." As the Highland darkness gathered around the ancient castle, Harold and Margaret sat in silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had inherited. They had come to Scotland as skeptical elderly tourists, expecting to spend a few days looking at ruins before returning to their quiet life in Pennsylvania. Instead, they had become the guardians of a secret that had been hidden for over 250 years, the inheritors of a trust that connected them to centuries of Scottish history and culture. The mockery they had endured back home, the skeptical comments and well-meaning advice to abandon their foolish dreams, now seemed not just wrong but tragically short-sighted. Everyone who had laughed at the elderly couple inheriting a worthless castle had failed to understand that some things have value that cannot be measured in simple financial terms. Alexander Mackenzie had understood this when he created the hidden treasury. He had preserved these treasures not because he was greedy or paranoid, but because he recognized that cultural heritage, once lost, can never be recovered. Art and artifacts that represent the pinnacle of human creativity and craftsmanship are irreplaceable, worth protecting not just for their monetary value, but for their ability to connect future generations to their past. And now, through a chain of inheritance that stretched across 3 centuries and an ocean, that responsibility had fallen to Harold and Margaret Thompson, 2 people who had spent their lives working with their hands, raising their children with practical values, and finding contentment in simple pleasures, had become the guardians of one of Europe's most significant hidden treasures. As they finally made their way back to their rental car, both of them moved with the careful deliberation of people carrying something precious. They didn't speak during the propped drive back to their bed and breakfast, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what they had discovered. The treasure was real, more real than anything they had ever imagined. But with that reality came responsibility, not just legal and financial responsibility, but moral obligation to honor Alexander Mackenzie's trust and ensure that his carefully preserved heritage would continue to benefit future generations. That night, lying in their narrow bed in the converted farmhouse, Harold and Margaret stared at the ceiling and tried to comprehend how completely their lives had changed in the space of a single day. Just 24 hours earlier, they had been elderly pensioners, worried about medical bills and home repairs. Now they were the legal owners of a treasure trove that could secure not just their own future, but the futures of their children and grandchildren for generations to come. But more than the money, more than the security and comfort that such wealth could provide, they understood that they had been entrusted with something far more significant than personal fortune. They had become the custodians of history, the guardians of cultural artifacts that belonged not just to them, but to all of humanity. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in their lives, Harold and Margaret Thompson had the opportunity to do something truly significant, something that would matter long after they were gone. They could honor Alexander Mackenzie's trust, preserve Scotland's heritage, and ensure that future generations would have access to the cultural treasures that connected them to their past. As sleep finally began to claim them in the early hours of the Highland morning, both Harold and Margaret understood that their quiet retirement was over. They had discovered not just treasure, but purpose, a mission that would transform the remaining years of their lives from simple survival into something approaching greatness. The mockery they had endured was forgotten now, replaced by the certain knowledge that sometimes the most unlikely people find themselves called to the most extraordinary tasks, and sometimes the dreams that others dismiss as foolish turn out to be the most important journeys of all. The next morning dawned grey and misty over the Scottish Highlands, but for Harold and Margaret Thompson, the world had never seemed brighter or more full of possibility. They sat in the small dining room of their bed and breakfast, surrounded by other guests eating porridge and discussing hiking plans, while they struggled to process the reality that they were now the guardians of a treasure collection worth more than the annual budget of most small countries. Fiona, their cheerful hostess, poured them fresh tea and commented on how much better they looked than when they'd first arrived. "You both seem lighter somehow," she said with the intuitive wisdom of someone who had spent decades caring for travelers. "Did your visit to the castle go well?" Margaret and Harold exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. They had agreed the night before that they needed professional guidance before telling anyone about their discovery, but the weight of the secret was already beginning to feel overwhelming. "It was enlightening," Margaret said carefully, "much more than we expected." After breakfast, they drove back to Castle Ravenshollow, this time armed with a digital camera, measuring tape, and notebooks. If they were going to seek professional help, they needed to document everything they had found with the kind of systematic thoroughness that would convince skeptical experts that their discovery was genuine. Harold approached the task with the methodical precision he had learned during 47 years of troubleshooting complex machinery. They photographed each chamber from multiple angles, catalogued every significant artifact, and created detailed maps of the underground complex. Margaret, meanwhile, focused on the historical documents, carefully photographing each page of Alexander Mackenzie's journal and the various letters and legal papers that told the story of how the treasure had come to be hidden. The more they learned about Alexander Mackenzie and his motivations, the more they understood the magnitude of what they had inherited. According to his carefully preserved records, the treasure represented not just his family's wealth, but artifacts and valuables that had been entrusted to him by dozens of other Scottish families during the turbulent years following the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The failed Jacobite uprising had resulted in brutal English reprisals against Highland culture and Scottish independence. Ancient clan systems were destroyed, traditional dress was banned, and the English crown systematically seized Scottish estates and treasures. Faced with the prospect of losing everything their ancestors had built, many Scottish families had turned to Alexander Mackenzie, whose remote castle and reputation for discretion made him an ideal guardian for their most precious possessions. He wasn't just hiding his own treasure, Margaret realized as she read through letter after letter from desperate Scottish nobles. He was preserving the cultural heritage of an entire people who were being systematically destroyed by political persecution. The documents revealed that Alexander had spent over 20 years carefully collecting and cataloging artifacts that ranged from ancient Celtic jewelry to Renaissance masterpieces acquired during the Scottish nobility's connections with European courts. He had commissioned the underground chambers to be built with the most advanced preservation techniques of his era, creating a climate-controlled environment that had kept the treasures in remarkable condition for over 2 centuries. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered that Alexander had left detailed instructions for his heirs about what to do with the collection when it was finally safe to reveal it. His vision had been to eventually create a museum that would celebrate Scottish heritage and educate future generations about the rich culture that had nearly been lost to political oppression. "We're not just treasure hunters," Harold said as they sat in the great hall reading through Alexander's final letter to his descendants. "We're the executors of a man's last will and testament, carrying out wishes that are over 250 years old." That evening, back at the bed and breakfast, they made their first phone call to the outside world since discovering the treasure. Sarah MacLeod, the Edinburgh solicitor who had handled Millicent McTavish's estate, listened with growing amazement as Margaret described what they had found beneath the castle. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said after a long pause, "if what you're describing is accurate, you've made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Scottish history. But I must warn you that a find of this magnitude will require extensive authentication and will attract attention from parties you may not be prepared to deal with." Sarah recommended that they immediately contact Dr. James Sinclair, a professor of Scottish history at the University of Edinburgh, who specialized in 18th-century Highland culture. She also suggested they would need to engage experts in art authentication, insurance evaluation, and cultural preservation before making any public announcements about their discovery. The most important thing, Sarah emphasized, is that you document everything thoroughly and ensure that proper legal procedures are followed from the beginning. A collection of this value and historical significance will be subject to claims from multiple sources: the Scottish government, museums, other potential heirs to various families whose artifacts may be included, and, unfortunately, less legitimate interests as well. Dr. Sinclair agreed to meet them at the castle the following day, and Margaret spent a sleepless night worrying about whether they were making the right decision in trusting an academic stranger with their secret. But when the professor arrived, a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind eyes of someone who had spent his life studying the past, their concerns quickly evaporated. "My God," Dr. Sinclair whispered as he examined the first few artifacts in the treasure rooms. "These aren't just valuable objects. Some of these pieces have been considered lost to history for over 200 years. That chalice there, it's from the abbey at Iona, thought to have been destroyed during the Reformation. And that manuscript, I believe it's a copy of the Book of Kells that scholars have theorized about but never seen." Dr. Sinclair spent 3 days at the castle, carefully examining and photographing the collection, while Harold and Margaret watched with growing amazement as he identified artifact after artifact that had historical significance far beyond their monetary value. Many of the pieces had provenance that could be traced back to specific Scottish clans, royal households, or religious institutions that had been scattered during the political upheavals of the 18th century. Alexander Mackenzie wasn't just a collector, Dr. Sinclair explained, as he studied a set of ceremonial Highland dress that had belonged to the last chief of Clan MacDonald. He was a preservationist, someone who understood that cultural identity survives through physical objects as much as through stories and traditions. He saved pieces of Scottish heritage that would have been lost forever if they had remained in their original locations. But Dr. Sinclair also confirmed Sarah MacLeod's warnings about the complexities they would face in revealing their discovery. "A collection of this significance will attract attention from governments, museums, and collectors around the world," he cautioned. "You'll need legal representation, security arrangements, insurance coverage, and authentication procedures that could take months or even years to complete." The authentication process began immediately, with Dr. Sinclair contacting colleagues at universities and museums across Europe who specialized in various aspects of the collection. Art historians from the Louvre traveled to Scotland to examine the Renaissance paintings. Celtic scholars from Trinity College Dublin analyzed the ancient jewelry and religious artifacts. Manuscript experts from the British Museum studied the illuminated books and historical documents. Each authentication confirmed what Harold and Margaret had hardly dared to hope. The collection was not only genuine, but included pieces of incalculable historical and cultural value. The estimated worth of the treasure continued to climb as each expert examination revealed new masterpieces and confirmed the provenance of pieces that had been thought lost to history. Meanwhile, despite their attempts to maintain secrecy, word of the discovery began to spread through the small network of scholars, historians, and cultural preservationists who had been consulted for authentication. The story was simply too extraordinary to remain completely confidential. And within weeks, reporters were calling the bed and breakfast where Harold and Margaret were staying, trying to verify rumors about an incredible treasure discovery at a Highland castle. The first newspaper article appeared in the Edinburgh Scotsman under the headline, "American Couple May Have Discovered Lost Scottish Heritage Collection." The story was carefully written to protect Harold and Margaret's privacy while confirming that a significant archaeological discovery had been made at Castle Ravenshallow and that authentication procedures were ongoing. But once the story broke in Scotland, it spread rapidly to international media outlets. Within days, reporters from London, Paris, and even American television networks were requesting interviews with the elderly couple who had inherited a castle and discovered what was being described as one of Europe's most significant private treasure collections. Harold and Margaret, who had never spoken to a reporter in their lives, found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had never sought and weren't entirely comfortable with. Dr. Sinclair and Sarah MacLeod helped them navigate the media attention, arranging carefully controlled interviews and ensuring that their privacy and security were protected as much as possible. The reaction back home in Millbrook was everything they might have expected and more. The same neighbors who had mocked their foolish trip to Scotland were now calling constantly, wanting to know if the newspaper stories they were seeing online could possibly be true. The hardware store clerk who had joked about Harold's palace was now treating him with a deference that made Harold profoundly uncomfortable. Their children's reactions were equally dramatic and complicated. Linda, who had initially been the most skeptical about the inheritance, was suddenly very interested in her parents' welfare and began calling daily to discuss their security situation and offer advice about financial management that Harold and Margaret had never requested. David, who had dismissed the castle as a worthless burden, was now convinced that his parents needed his protection from people who might try to take advantage of their sudden wealth. He began making plans to visit Scotland, despite having shown no interest in traveling anywhere for years. Only Thomas remained consistent in his response, offering genuine congratulations while expressing concern about the pressures they must be facing. "I'm so proud of you both," he said during one of their weekly phone calls, "but I hope you're taking care of yourselves through all this craziness. Don't let other people's expectations change who you are." But the most dramatic change in Harold and Margaret's circumstances came when the authentication process was completed and the full scope of their inheritance became clear. Conservative estimates placed the value of the collection at £250 million, with some experts suggesting the true worth could be significantly higher given the unique historical provenance of many pieces. More importantly, the discovery had captured the imagination of the Scottish people and the international community in ways that transcended simple monetary calculations. The story of an elderly American couple inheriting a crumbling castle and discovering a lost treasure trove of Scottish heritage resonated with people around the world who understood that some things have value far beyond what markets can measure. The Scottish National Trust approached them about the possibility of creating a permanent exhibition at Castle Ravenshallow itself, which would be restored to house the collection and serve as a cultural centre celebrating Scottish Highland heritage. Museums from around the world expressed interest in hosting travelling exhibitions of selected pieces. Universities offered to fund research projects that would study and document the historical significance of individual artifacts. What happens next will turn this inheritance into something beyond their wildest dreams, reveal secrets that have been hidden for over 3 centuries, and transform this elderly couple from objects of mockery into guardians of one of Scotland's greatest lost treasures. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The transformation in Harold and Margaret's daily lives was so complete and sudden that they sometimes felt like they were living in someone else's story. Just months earlier, they had been elderly pensioners living on Social Security, worrying about medical bills and home repairs. Now they were the subjects of international news coverage, courted by museums and universities, and consulted by historians and cultural preservationists from around the world. The practical aspects of managing their newfound wealth and responsibility required a complete restructuring of their lives. They hired a team of advisors, including lawyers who specialized in cultural property law, accountants who understood international estate planning, and security consultants who could protect both them and the collection from the various threats that accompanied sudden wealth and fame. The insurance requirements alone were staggering. Lloyd's of London assigned a team of specialists to evaluate and protect a collection that was not only worth hundreds of millions of pounds, but included irreplaceable artifacts that could never be replaced if damaged or stolen. The castle itself had to be fitted with state-of-the-art security systems, climate control equipment, and conservation facilities that would preserve the treasures for future generations. But beyond the practical complications, Harold and Margaret struggled with the emotional and psychological adjustments that accompanied their transformation from ordinary retirees to guardians of cultural heritage. The media attention was overwhelming for people who had lived their entire lives in small-town anonymity. Suddenly, their opinions about Scottish history, cultural preservation, and international museum policy were being solicited by reporters and academics who had never heard of them just weeks earlier. "It's strange," Margaret confided to Dr. Sinclair during one of his regular visits to oversee the conservation work. "A few months ago, people in our hometown thought we were foolish old dreamers. Now reporters are calling us visionaries and heroes, but we haven't really changed at all. We're still the same people who lived quietly on Maple Street, worried about paying the heating bill." Dr. Sinclair, who had become not just their advisor but a trusted friend, understood the disorientation they were experiencing. "The treasure was always there," he reminded her gently. "Alexander Mackenzie's vision was always waiting for the right people to carry it forward. You didn't create the collection's significance, you just had the courage to discover it and the wisdom to honor the trust it represents." The restoration of Castle Ravenshallow became a project that captured the imagination of preservation enthusiasts and historians around the world. Using techniques that combine traditional Scottish craftsmanship with modern conservation technology, teams of specialists worked to rebuild the sections of the castle that had fallen into ruin while carefully preserving the areas that retained their original character. The hidden chambers were reinforced and fitted with museum-quality environmental controls that would protect the artifacts indefinitely. New exhibition spaces were created that would allow public access to the collection while maintaining the security and preservation standards required for objects of such importance. Harold found himself unexpectedly fascinated by every aspect of the restoration process. His decades of experience with mechanical systems and problem-solving proved valuable in addressing some of the technical challenges involved in modernizing a 16th-century structure without compromising its historical integrity. He spent hours consulting with engineers, architects, and craftsmen who were bringing the castle back to life, discovering a passion for historical preservation that gave his retirement a purpose he had never anticipated. Margaret immersed herself in the historical research that surrounded the collection, working with scholars to document the provenance of each artifact and understand the cultural context that had produced such treasures. She became something of an expert on 18th-century Highland history, corresponding with academics around the world and even presenting papers at conferences about the social and political conditions that had led to the dispersal and concealment of Scottish cultural artifacts. The financial security that the discovery provided was almost secondary to the sense of purpose and accomplishment that Harold and Margaret experienced as they worked to fulfill Alexander Mackenzie's vision. They established a foundation to manage the collection and ensure its preservation for future generations, with revenue from museum admissions and educational programs supporting ongoing conservation work and scholarly research. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of their transformation was the way their story inspired others to pursue dreams and take risks that they might otherwise have dismissed as impractical. Letters arrived daily from around the world, from elderly people who had been inspired to travel to places they had always wanted to see, from families who had decided to research their own genealogical connections to historical properties, from individuals who had chosen to pursue passions they had deferred for decades in favor of practical considerations. "We never intended to become examples of anything," Harold said during one of the many interviews they gave in the months following the discovery. "We just refused to let other people's expectations limit our choices. When everyone told us we were too old, too poor, and too naive to investigate our inheritance, we decided to find out for ourselves what we had been given." The grand opening of the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum, 18 months after Harold and Margaret's first visit to their inherited castle, was attended by dignitaries from around the world. The Queen of the United Kingdom sent a personal representative to acknowledge the significance of the collection and the couple's contribution to preserving Scottish heritage. The Scottish First Minister delivered remarks about the importance of cultural preservation and the role that private individuals can play in protecting national treasures. Harold and Margaret, now in their mid-70s but energized by their unexpected second career as cultural preservationists, cut the ribbon to officially open the museum that bore their names as founding benefactors. The ceremony was broadcast live on Scottish television and covered by news organizations across Europe and North America. But the most moving moment of the opening ceremony came when they unveiled a special exhibition dedicated to Alexander Mackenzie and his vision for preserving Scottish heritage. His portrait, painted by an unknown artist in the 18th century and discovered among the personal artifacts in the final treasure chamber, now held a place of honor in the museum's main gallery. Below the portrait, Margaret had composed an inscription that captured the spirit of their discovery and their commitment to honoring the trust they had inherited. Alexander Mackenzie preserved these treasures not for personal gain, but for future generations who would understand that cultural heritage belongs to all humanity. We are honored to serve as guardians of his legacy and to share these wonders with the world. The success of the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Visitors came from around the world to see the collection that had been hidden for over 2 centuries, and the museum quickly became one of Scotland's premier cultural attractions. Tour buses filled the narrow Highland roads that led to the castle, and the small village that had once been forgotten by tourism became a destination in its own right. Local bed and breakfasts, restaurants, and shops experienced a boom in business as thousands of visitors came to see the treasure that had been discovered by 2 elderly Americans who refused to accept that their dreams were too ambitious for people their age. The economic impact on the region was substantial, but the cultural impact was even more significant. The collection served as a powerful reminder of the importance of preserving heritage and the role that individuals can play in protecting cultural treasures for future generations. School groups came from across Scotland and beyond to learn about Highland history and the importance of cultural preservation. University students conducted research projects using the museum's archives and conservation facilities. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Harold and Margaret's discovery inspired a renewed interest in genealogical research and family history throughout Scotland and the Scottish diaspora around the world. Families began investigating their own connections to Highland culture and history, and several other significant archaeological discoveries were made by individuals who had been inspired by the Thompsons' example to explore properties and investigate family legends that had previously been dismissed as wishful thinking. The transformation in Harold and Margaret's personal lives was equally profound. The financial security provided by the treasure allowed them to live with a comfort and dignity they had never known. But more importantly, their work with the museum and foundation gave them a sense of purpose and accomplishment that transcended any monetary considerations. They maintained a small apartment in Edinburgh to be close to the museum and the ongoing conservation work, but they also restored their old house on Maple Street, turning it into a gathering place for their children and grandchildren who finally understood that their elderly parents had been harboring dreams and capabilities that nobody had ever suspected. Their relationships with their children improved dramatically as Linda, David, and Thomas came to appreciate the courage and vision their parents had demonstrated in pursuing their inheritance despite widespread skepticism and discouragement. The family gatherings at the restored Maple Street house became celebrations not just of financial success, but of the vindication of dreams that had once been dismissed as foolish. The success of the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum also led to other opportunities for Harold and Margaret to contribute to cultural preservation efforts around the world. They became consultants to other historical preservation projects, sharing their experience and expertise with organizations that were working to protect and interpret cultural heritage sites. They funded scholarship programs for students interested in archaeology, art history, and museum studies, ensuring that future generations would have the knowledge and skills needed to continue their work. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of their discovery was the reminder it provided that extraordinary opportunities can come to ordinary people who have the courage to pursue the extraordinary. Harold and Margaret had not sought fame or fortune. They had simply refused to accept other people's definitions of what was possible for people their age and circumstances. The treasure was wonderful. Margaret reflected during an interview for a documentary about their discovery that was produced 3 years after the museum opened. But the real discovery was that we were capable of far more than we had ever imagined. Age doesn't have to mean the end of adventure or the abandonment of dreams. Sometimes, the most important chapters of our lives are the ones we write last. The international recognition that Harold and Margaret received for their contribution to cultural preservation included honorary doctorates from universities in Scotland and the United States, recognition from UNESCO for their work in heritage conservation, and awards from numerous historical and archaeological organizations. But the recognition they treasured most came from the visitors to their museum families, who brought their children to learn about Scottish heritage, elderly couples who were inspired by their example to pursue their own dreams, scholars who used the collection for research that advanced human understanding of Highland culture and history. As Harold and Margaret entered their 80s, still actively involved in the management and development of the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum, they could look back on their transformation from struggling retirees to internationally recognized cultural preservationists with a sense of profound satisfaction. They had not only secured their own financial future, but had created a lasting legacy that would educate and inspire visitors for generations to come. The castle that had once been a crumbling ruin threatening to bankrupt them with its maintenance costs had become a living monument to the power of perseverance, the importance of cultural preservation, and the extraordinary things that can happen when ordinary people refuse to let others define the limits of what is possible. Anyone can uncover hidden treasures if they're willing to look beyond surface appearances and have the courage to pursue dreams that others dismiss as foolish. 5 years after Harold and Margaret Thompson first stepped foot in the crumbling ruins of Castle Ravenshallow, they stood once again on the restored battlements, but this time they were not alone. Below them, the castle courtyard bustled with activity as visitors from around the world explored the museum that had become one of Scotland's most celebrated cultural attractions. Tour guides led groups through the exhibitions, school children sketched artifacts in the educational center, and scholars worked quietly in the research library that had been established in the castle's restored East Wing. The transformation was so complete that Margaret sometimes had to remind herself that this magnificent cultural center had once been a pile of crumbling stones that everyone had dismissed as worthless. The broken walls had been rebuilt using traditional Highland masonry techniques. The collapsed roofs had been restored with slate quarried from the same mountains that had provided materials for the original construction, and the empty windows now gleamed with specially manufactured glass that replicated the appearance of medieval glazing while providing modern insulation and security. But the physical restoration of Castle Ravenshallow was only the most visible aspect of the legacy that Harold and Margaret had chosen to create with their extraordinary inheritance. The decisions they had made about how to use their discovery had rippled outward in ways that neither of them could have anticipated, transforming not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who had been touched by their story. The choice to establish the Ravenshallow Heritage Foundation, rather than simply selling the treasure collection, had been made after months of careful consideration and consultation. Experts in cultural preservation, legal scholars, and representatives of the Scottish government. While they could have easily become billionaires by auctioning the artifacts to private collectors, Harold and Margaret understood that Alexander Mackenzie's vision had been to preserve Scottish heritage for future generations, not to enrich individual inheritors. "We're not the owners of this collection," Margaret had explained to a reporter during one of the early interviews about their plans for the treasure. "We're custodians, temporarily responsible for something that belongs to all of humanity. Our job is to make sure these treasures are preserved, studied, and shared in ways that honor the vision of the man who saved them." The foundation they established was structured to ensure that the collection would be protected in perpetuity while generating sufficient revenue to support ongoing conservation work, scholarly research, and educational programs. The majority of the artifacts remained permanently at Castle Ravenshallow, displayed in climate-controlled galleries that allowed public access while maintaining museum-quality preservation standards. Selected pieces traveled to partner institutions around the world, spreading awareness of Scottish Highland culture and the importance of cultural preservation. The revenue generated by museum admissions, educational programs, gift shop sales, and traveling exhibitions was supplemented by endowment funds that Harold and Margaret had established using their personal share of the inheritance. This financial structure ensured that the museum could operate independently while continuing to grow and develop new programs that served the Foundation's mission of cultural education and preservation. But beyond the formal structure of the Foundation and museum, Harold and Margaret had insisted on creating programs that reflected their personal values and their understanding of the challenges faced by ordinary people who dreamed of extraordinary things. The Ravenshallow Scholarship Program provided funding for students from working-class backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in archaeology, art history, museum studies, or cultural preservation. Many of the recipients were the first members of their families to attend university. Just as Harold and Margaret had been the first members of their families to travel internationally or manage cultural institutions. The Community Heritage Initiative, another program established by the Foundation, provided grants and technical assistance to small communities throughout Scotland, and beyond that, wanted to preserve and interpret their own local history. Harold, drawing on his decades of experience with practical problem-solving, personally consulted on many of these projects, helping small towns and rural communities develop sustainable approaches to heritage preservation that didn't require enormous financial resources. "Every community has stories worth preserving," Harold would tell the groups of local historians and community volunteers who attended the Foundation's workshops on heritage preservation. "You don't need to discover buried treasure to make your history matter. You just need to care enough to document it, preserve it, and share it with others who might learn from what your ancestors experienced." The transformation of the surrounding region had been equally dramatic and far more widespread than anyone had anticipated. When Castle Ravenshallow first reopened as a museum, the nearest village was a collection of perhaps 50 houses, a single pub, and a post office that operated 3 days a week. The economic opportunities in the area had been so limited that young people routinely left for Edinburgh or Glasgow as soon as they finished their education, leaving behind an aging population and a declining local economy. But the success of the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum had catalyzed a renaissance in the entire Highland region. The hundreds of thousands of visitors who came to see the treasure collection needed accommodations, meals, transportation, and souvenirs. Bed and breakfasts that had struggled to attract guests during the brief summer tourist season now operated at capacity year-round. Restaurants that had once served primarily local farmers and occasional hikers now employed professional chefs and featured Highland cuisine that attracted food enthusiasts from around the world. Local craftsmen found new markets for traditional Highland products as visitors sought authentic Scottish woolens, pottery, and metalwork that reflected the same artistic traditions represented in the museum's collection. Young people who had left the region for lack of opportunity began returning to start businesses, raise families, and contribute to communities that were experiencing growth and prosperity for the first time in generations. Margaret took particular pride in the educational programs that had developed around the museum's success. The Ravenshallow Institute for Highland Studies, established in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, offered residential programs that brought scholars, students, and interested members of the public to the region for intensive study of Scottish history, culture, and traditions. Participants stayed in restored buildings throughout the area, shopped in local businesses, and contributed to an intellectual and cultural vitality that had transformed the region from a remote rural backwater into a recognized center of learning and scholarship. The Institute's summer programs for American students of Scottish heritage had become particularly popular, bringing hundreds of young people each year to study their ancestral culture while contributing thousands of dollars to the local economy. Many of these students returned later as tourists with their own families, creating lasting connections between the Highland community and the Scottish diaspora around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the cultural transformation that had grown out of Harold and Margaret's discovery was the way it had inspired similar efforts throughout Scotland and beyond. The success of Castle Ravenshallow had demonstrated that cultural preservation could be economically sustainable while serving important educational and social purposes, and communities throughout the world had begun to look at their own heritage resources with new appreciation and ambition. The Scottish government had established a Heritage Discovery Grant program modelled on the Ravenshallow Foundation's community initiatives, providing funding for grassroots preservation efforts that might uncover significant historical resources. Several important archaeological discoveries had been made by individuals and communities inspired by Harold and Margaret's example, including a Viking settlement in the Orkney Islands and a collection of medieval manuscripts in a Highland abbey that had been thought completely destroyed during the Reformation. The international recognition that the Ravenshallow Heritage Museum had received had also elevated Scotland's profile as a destination for cultural tourism. Visitors who came primarily to see the Mackenzie treasure often extended their stays to explore other Scottish heritage sites, contributing to a broader renaissance in cultural appreciation that had economic benefits throughout the country. Harold and Margaret's personal transformation during these years had been as dramatic as the changes they had catalyzed in the world around them. The shy, uncertain elderly couple who had once worried about paying their heating bills had evolved into confident, articulate advocates for cultural preservation who were consulted by governments, universities, and international organizations on matters of heritage policy and museum management. Margaret, in particular, had discovered talents and interests that she had never known she possessed. Her work with the historical documents in Alexander Mackenzie's collection had led her to become something of an expert on 18th-century Highland history and genealogy. She had authored several scholarly articles about the social and political conditions that had led to the dispersal of Scottish cultural artifacts, and she was frequently invited to speak at academic conferences and historical societies. Her presentations combined rigorous historical scholarship with personal insights drawn from her experience as a guardian of cultural heritage, creating a unique perspective that resonated with both academic audiences and general public. She had a gift for making complex historical concepts accessible to ordinary people, and her talks often inspired listeners to investigate their own family histories and community heritage. Harold had found similar fulfillment in the technical and logistical challenges of museum management and historical preservation. His engineering background and practical problem-solving skills had proved invaluable in addressing the complex challenges involved in maintaining a world-class museum in a remote Highland location. He had overseen the installation of sophisticated climate control systems, security equipment, and conservation facilities, while ensuring that modern technology was integrated sensitively with the castle's historic architecture. His work had attracted attention from preservation professionals around the world, and he had been invited to consult on similar projects throughout Europe and North America. The combination of his technical expertise and his understanding of the human dimensions of heritage preservation had made him a sought-after advisor for communities and institutions facing similar challenges. But beyond their professional accomplishments, Harold and Margaret had experienced profound personal growth that had enriched every aspect of their lives. The confidence and sense of purpose they had gained through their work with the foundation had transformed their relationships with their children, their community, and each other. Their 3 children, who had once treated them with the benevolent condescension often directed toward elderly parents, now sought their advice on important decisions and spoke with pride about their parents' accomplishments. Linda had become actively involved in the foundation's work, using her business experience to help develop sustainable funding strategies for heritage preservation projects. David had found stability and purpose, working as a security consultant for the museum. Drawing on his knowledge of Highland geography and his understanding of the challenges facing cultural institutions, Thomas had brought his own students to participate in the Institute's educational programs, creating connections between American schools and Scottish heritage education. The grandchildren, who had once visited dutifully but without particular enthusiasm, now competed for opportunities to spend summers working at the museum and participating in the Foundation's programs. Several had chosen college majors and career paths influenced by their grandparents' work, and the family conversations that had once focused on weather and health now ranged across topics of history, culture, and social responsibility. Harold and Margaret's relationship with each other had also deepened and strengthened through their shared work and the challenges they had faced together. The partnership they had developed in managing the foundation and museum drew on the best qualities of both, while allowing each to contribute their unique strengths to their common mission. "We've been married for 57 years, Margaret reflected during an interview for a documentary about their work, but in some ways we're just getting to know each other. We've discovered capabilities and interests that neither of us knew we had, and we've learned to see each other as partners in ways that go beyond just sharing a household and raising children together." The legacy they were creating extended far beyond their own lifetimes, through the institutional structures they had established and the people they had inspired and trained to continue their work. The Ravenshallow Heritage Foundation was governed by a board that included representatives from the Scottish Government, the University of Edinburgh, the local community, and the Mackenzie family, ensuring that Alexander Mackenzie's vision would continue to guide the institution's development long after Harold and Margaret were no longer able to provide direct oversight. The endowment they had established was structured to grow over time, providing increasing resources for conservation work, research, and educational programming that would serve future generations. The scholarship programs they had created were already producing graduates who were pursuing careers in cultural preservation, many of whom had returned to work for the foundation or had established similar programs elsewhere. Perhaps most importantly, the story of their discovery and the choices they had made about how to use their inheritance had become a powerful inspiration for people around the world who faced their own decisions about how to balance personal benefit with broader social responsibility. The example they had set demonstrated that individuals could make choices that served purposes larger than their own immediate interests without sacrificing their personal well-being or financial security. "We never set out to be role models," Harold said during one of the many interviews they gave in their later years. "We just tried to do what seemed right with what we had been given. But if our story encourages other people to think about how their own choices and opportunities might benefit others, then I suppose that's a legacy worth leaving." The international recognition they received continued to grow as the impact of their work became more widely understood. They were awarded honorary doctorates from universities in Scotland, England, Ireland, Canada, and the United States. UNESCO recognized their contribution to World Heritage preservation. The Scottish Government honored them with membership in the Order of the Thistle, Scotland's highest chivalric honor. But the recognition they treasured most came from the letters and visits from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by their example. Elderly couples who had been inspired to pursue travel and adventure. They had thought beyond their reach. Families who had investigated their own heritage connections and discovered meaningful links to their past. Young people who had chosen careers in cultural preservation because of what they had learned about the importance of protecting humanity's shared heritage. A typical letter, which Margaret kept framed in their private study, came from a woman in Canada whose Scottish grandmother had always claimed their family had once owned land in the Highlands but had been forced to flee during the clearances. Inspired by the Thompson story, the woman had researched her family history, discovered documented connections to a specific Highland clan, and established a scholarship fund for Indigenous students studying traditional crafts and cultural preservation. "You showed me that family stories matter," the letter concluded, "and that individual people can make choices that honor their ancestors while helping future generations. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to discover who you really are and what you're capable of accomplishing." As Harold and Margaret entered their mid-80s, they began to reduce their direct involvement in the day-to-day management of the foundation while remaining active as advisors and ambassadors for the organization's mission. The museum operated smoothly under professional management. The educational programs continued to grow and develop, and the community transformation they had catalyzed continued to generate benefits throughout the Highland region. They spent increasing amounts of time at their restored home on Maple Street, which had become a gathering place for family celebrations and informal meetings with other heritage preservation advocates. The house that had once represented the modest limitations of their retirement had been transformed into a symbol of the extraordinary things that ordinary people could accomplish when they had the courage to pursue their dreams. The vegetable garden that Margaret had always tended still produced abundant crops, but now the excess was shared with visitors who came to learn about the foundation's work. Harold's basement workshop still contained the tools he had used to fix neighbors' problems for decades, but now it also housed documentation and artifacts from their Scottish adventure that would eventually be donated to local historical societies. Their daily routines had settled once again into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage, but their conversations now ranged across topics that would have been unimaginable during their earlier retirement. They discussed conservation techniques with museum professionals, debated heritage policy with government officials, and shared stories of their adventures with grandchildren who were beginning their own journeys into adulthood. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the front porch where they had first read the letter that changed their lives, watching their neighborhood settle into twilight, while reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had taken them from financial anxiety to international recognition, from provincial obscurity to global influence, from modest retirement to meaningful legacy. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had listened to everyone who told us not to go to Scotland?" Margaret asked during one of these evening conversations. Harold considered the question while watching their neighbors' grandchildren play in the yard across the street, their laughter carrying across the summer air like music. "I try not to think about that," he said finally, "but I suppose Alexander Mackenzie's treasure would still be sitting in those chambers, waiting for someone brave enough to look for it, and we'd still be here, wondering if we'd made the right choice by playing it safe." Margaret nodded, understanding that their decision to pursue their inheritance, despite widespread discouragement, had been about more than just curiosity or financial opportunity. It had been about refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was possible, about maintaining hope in the face of skepticism, about believing that life could still hold surprises and adventures even in its final chapters. "I'm glad we took the chance," she said softly, "not just because of the treasure, but because of everything that came after, the museum, the foundation, the people we've met, the work we've been able to do. We became more than we ever thought we could be." Harold reached over and took her hand, noting how the evening light caught the gold wedding band she had worn for nearly 6 decades. "We always had it in us," he said. "We just needed the right opportunity to discover it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Maple Street, Harold and Margaret Thompson sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived and purposes well served. They had inherited a crumbling castle and discovered a treasure beyond their wildest dreams. But their greatest accomplishment was the legacy they had chosen to create with their extraordinary gift. The museum that bore their name would continue to educate and inspire visitors for generations to come. The foundation they had established would continue to support cultural preservation and education long after they were gone. The community they had helped to revitalize would continue to benefit from the tourism and scholarship they had attracted. The people they had inspired would continue to pursue their own dreams and create their own legacies. But perhaps most importantly, their story would continue to remind the world that extraordinary opportunities can come to ordinary people, that age doesn't have to mean the end of adventure, and that the choices individuals make about how to use their gifts and opportunities can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond their own lives. Anyone can create a lasting legacy if they're willing to look beyond their own immediate interests and consider how their choices might benefit future generations. As the Highland sun set behind the restored towers of Castle Ravenshallow, visible in the distance from the museum's highest window, the last visitors of the day gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. But the treasures they had seen, the stories they had heard, and the inspiration they had received would travel with them to homes around the world, carrying forward the vision of Alexander Mackenzie and the legacy of Harold and Margaret Thompson to new places and new generations. Because for Harold and Margaret, and for everyone who visits their museum or hears their story, the greatest treasure was never gold or jewels or priceless artifacts. It was the reminder that it's never too late to discover who you really are, what you're truly capable of accomplishing, and how your choices can make the world a little brighter for those who come after you. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep exploring with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that the best adventures often begin when others think you're too old to have them.